We all know that Christopher Columbus was the first European to reach the Americas, right? Wrong! Most people nowadays are better informed as to the fact that the actual first European on the American continent was none other than Leif Erikson, the Icelandic Viking. That's about all they know though, and if you're in the same situation, we can hardly blame you. Leif Erikson's discovery of the Americas, and his life in general for that matter, isn't widely covered since it's honestly more of a technicality, and it didn't open up a bridge between the two worlds. It was just a kind of historic blip of a man from another land spending a brief stint on what might as well have been an alien planet before eventually returning home, leaving many at the time taking his stories as hearsay rather than history. Today, however, we know that while not the trendsetter, he was the first, and that's a position that deserves a little recognition at least. So stick around for the story of how this intrepid traveller first found his way to a brand new world. Leif Erikson's story starts in 10th century Iceland, 1970 AD to be exact. Born to Erik the Red, a fiery-named man who later became the founder of the first ever Viking settlement in Greenland, no small coincidence there, and Þjóðhild Jörundsdóttir, who was his mum. Growing up in Iceland, Erik proved to be his father's son, with a fiery temper and an innate flair for exploration, moulded by his Nordic ways, but always with his eyes on the horizon, itching for adventure, which really didn't take long to arrive. At the ripe age of 12, Leif's father Erik was exiled from Iceland for manslaughter. Like we said, the fiery temper ran in the family. They pushed them out to the seas, eventually finding their way to Greenland in the far west and setting up the aforementioned first ever permanent settlement there, setting the trend for later in Leif's life. Fun fact, he actually called Greenland Greenland in order to mislead people to join him there, painting the picture of green pastures over the reality of icy tundras. Unfortunately for Leif though, a name alone changes nothing, and icy tundras were all his 12-year-old self had to call his new home, making Leif's life for the foreseeable future one of survival. His upbringing in the harsh landscapes of Greenland tempered his iron for the journeys that lay ahead. He grew up hearing stories of distant lands and seas, his imagination fueled by the tales of the Vikings, and his ambition stoked by the legacy of his father. This combo installed in him a burning desire to explore beyond the known horizon, which he didn't hesitate to pursue. By the time he reached adulthood, he'd become an experienced sailor, skilled in taming the elements to his needs. His reputation as a capable and daring navigator began to spread, in fact, and in a community that valued strength, resilience, and the spirit of adventure, this was everything. It was this burgeoning reputation that led him to his next big journey, a voyage to Norway. In 999 AD, driven by a mix of curiosity and the need to prove himself, Leif set sail for the Scandinavian nation. The journey was long and perilous, but Leif's skill as a navigator saw him through. Once he arrived, he was enthusiastically received, quickly gaining the favour of the locals. So much so, in fact, that he found his way before the royal court. Always on the lookout for strong and influential leaders, the King of Norway saw potential in this young Norseman for the furthering of his own agenda. You see, Olaf was looking to strengthen relations with his southern neighbours who were big on Christianity at the time. Establishing that same faith in his own corner of the world would warm them up to him greatly, something he and his kingdom were mighty keen on. And so, within the time that Leif stayed in Norway, the king gave him his best sales pitch, and Leif, seeing the strategic advantage and perhaps moved by the king's charisma, embraced the new faith wholeheartedly. Leif's conversion, as you may have guessed, was less of a personal shift and more of a political move that elevated his status in the eyes of the Norwegian court. The king entrusted him with the mission of spreading Christianity in Greenland, and in return, Leif would receive the king's royal favour, which took the shape of both material and logistic support, as well as a boost in political power. And there he was, Leif Erikson, now not only a seasoned explorer, but also a respected emissary of the king, ready to take on the next chapter of his life, bringing the glory of Christ to Greenland and its people. He wasn't just bringing back the good word though. Loaded onto his ship for the voyage were priests, holy relics, and other Christian paraphernalia with which to entice his people. The voyage back home was treacherous, but not only did Leif handle the safety of his party with ease, he even came to the rescue of others. During the trip back to Greenland, they came across a shipwrecked crew who, as they were taken in and brought back with them, had no trouble believing they travelled in the name of God. His missionary efforts were off to a strong start. Shortly after, they arrived home, and as you can imagine, Leif's return was quite the spectacle. He had come back with many more men than he had originally left with, along with foreign goods and a fancy new god to pray to. But as flashy as his presentation may have been, the locals weren't so easily swayed. Understandably, people were skeptical. I mean, these were hardcore pagans after all, set in their ways and attached to their traditions. Even his own father, Eric the Red, resisted the new faith. That was until Leif's mother, Theodhild, far more receptive to this new faith, refused to share a bed with Eric until he also converted. As you can imagine, this proved quite effective, and of course, once the chieftain had converted, the crowd followed suit, arguably making her one of the most important catalysts for Christianity to the region. Not only that, but she was also pivotal in getting Greenland's first church built, which still stands tall to this day. This very church became a focal point for the new Christian community within the settlement, a symbol of changing times, as well as a base for further missionary efforts. What further missionary efforts, you ask? Well, as we mentioned, Eric had picked the name Greenland to attract others and had briefly and sneakily returned to Iceland on occasion to recruit newcomers to bolster his numbers. This kickstarted a larger scale migration toward the island, to the point that Eric's settlement, while the first, was no longer the only settlement to speak of. And what did that mean for Leif at this point? More people to bless with the good word of the Lord, of course, so off he went, using the church as a base of operations between journeys all around the island. His reputation as the OG chieftain's son, moving those Bibles left and right. Similar to his home settlement, the faith spread strongly once it pushed past some initial resistance. And it was during one of these missionary trips that Leif heard about what would one day make him famous. You see, Leif was chatting with a merchant one day by the name of Bjarni Herofsson, and boy, did Bjarni have a story to tell. Apparently, a good 15 years ago, Bjarni found himself caught in a monstrosity of a storm. He thought it was a goner for sure. But lo and behold, he survived. They found their way till morning. The only problem was, the stormy winds had blown them way west, further than they'd ever been before, into God knows what kind of uncharted waters. It was there, though, that he saw it. Just on the horizon, further west still, was land. And a lot of it. And while at first it was mostly just bare rock, a little further south, what he found was, proper land, forest, birds, and actual stuff. There was life just over the horizon. Unfortunately, his fears and lack of preparation got the best of him, and instead of taking the risk and pushing further, he opted to turn around and head home, sticking to safe lest he be sorry. And while he did barely make it home, that distant, mysterious land on the horizon never left his mind, and he couldn't help but wonder what he had stumbled upon all those years ago. So to Leif, whose travelling flare was burning brighter than ever in the midst of his missionary efforts, well, that story was all he needed to hear. A chance to explore the era equivalent of an alien world, well within reach with proper preparation. Not only that, but it was a chance to carry on the legacy of his father, to be the first in yet another new land. His mind was made up. Adventure awaited. He quickly got to work, putting together a crew of about 35 daring men and enough supplies for twice that, ensuring they were ready for anything the journey would throw at them. He even made the poetic gesture of purchasing the very same ship that Bjarni used those 15 years ago, letting it guide them yet again to the new frontier. Everything was ready, and so, on that fateful day in the year 1000, they set sail westward from Greenland, head first into the endless blue, following nothing but the hearsay of an old merchant. Now, this is the part where you'd expect some tragic, dramatic voyage after which they barely make it alive, but it was actually pretty uneventful. The seas were unforgiving, sure, but Leif wasn't a rookie, so they made the journey with little to no issue beyond the expected discomfort. Once they did arrive, though, the worries started to set in. You see, they had aimed a bit high, and were met with a barren, rocky, and more importantly, lifeless landscape in what is today known as Baffin Island, Canada. which, in their disappointment, they aptly named Helluland, or Land of Flat Stones. For some reason, this tipped them over the edge, and they had already been dealing with nervousness and uncertainty from the very beginning of the trip. But thankfully, Leif didn't really feel that way. To him, they'd done it. They were there. The merchant's tale was true. All that was needed was a mere adjustment south and they'd arrive at their true destination. And so, after slapping his crew back into shape, Leif went south, sailing clean past the barren tundra and powering on with no intent of stopping until they found what they truly came for. After a couple of days, it seemed that they were there in what is today known as Labrador Coast. They came across plentiful greenery, dense forests full of timber and all kinds of other valuable resources. This was more like it. Leif, though, wasn't satisfied. As enticing as this may have been, his intuition screamed at him that something even better lay just a stone's throw away, and so they pushed on, leaving behind this newly dubbed Markland, named after its abundant woods, to instead seek greener pastures, literally. At this point, his crew was getting pretty antsy. They did have faith in their captain, but they felt they'd achieved what they'd come here for, so why were they still sailing around waiting for something better? I mean, they were wondering, when would it end? Well, the answer to their question arrived just in time, as after another couple of tiresome days, they finally arrived at the promised land they'd been chasing. Vinland stood before them. Named such after the wild grapes and berries they found there, Vinland was that literal greener pasture that was everything their last two stops hadn't been. Temperate weather, luscious fields and forests, food and fauna unlike anything they'd ever seen before. They'd come out here driven by little more than curiosity, but had found rewards beyond anything they could have ever bargained for. This was, as you can imagine, essentially heaven on earth compared to the trip they'd just pushed through. Their relief was hard to put into words because not only were supplies running low, but winter was just around the corner. And so, in what is nowadays known as northern Newfoundland, Leif and his men made their way ashore, excited to get nice and comfortable in this newfound land, ready to settle in for the winter and see what wonders were in store. As they cast their anchor and rowed to shore, the anticipation was electric, and when they finally touched land, Eriksson took his first step, foot sinking into the wet sand, the significance of what he'd just achieved truly hitting him. Here they were. Now remember, to us today, the Americas are just a fact of life, but you've got to understand that in those times, this was the equivalent of stepping on a brand new planet. A completely unknown land laid before them, foreign in each and every way. New wildlife, new weather, new foods to be eaten, and landscapes to be witnessed. Eriksson hadn't just carried on his father's legacy, he'd blown it out of the water. This initial amazement, though, quickly took the back seat. Their supplies were low, and winter was coming. They had work to do. They quickly got to it, chopping trees, gathering goods, and hunting for animals they'd never seen before, quickly building the first European settlement in the Americas, Leifsbúa. 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 Leifsbúa.
Leifsbúðir.
Anyway, here they would spend the winter. What wonders await us, they thought. What dangers might we encounter? Only time would tell what adventures they would find themselves in the midst of all these months to come. They were just as afraid as they were excited. But we're pretty sure that none of them could have expected what they faced next. All. You see, this isn't a Hollywood script. This is what actually happened, and unfortunately, just as life can bring us stories that put fiction to shame, it also sometimes gives us nothing to work with. Leif and his men took what they needed from the land, fascinated by its alien wonders, but not really doing anything differently than they would have done back home. They hunted, they prayed, and they waited. They just kind of lived life as usual, just somewhere new. Leif's brother Thorvald, though, had a much spicier experience in the New World, even meeting his end at the hands of the Native Americans, or as they called them then, Skraelings. That was on a later voyage, though, and thus is a story for another time, but he was technically the first European ever killed by Native Americans, and so if you want a video on that, you can let us know down below in the comments. But, unlike Thorvald's unfortunate end, Leif and his men came out the other end of the Canadian winter safe and sound, ready for the voyage home, ship stocked full of exotic goods and tales of their otherworldly adventure. And arrive home they did once that spring sun came over the horizon. Eager to see their loved ones again, they powered through the Labrador Sea, making their way back to Greenland as heroes, conquerors of unseen lands. Now again, let me set the scene for you here. They had set out months ago to a supposed continent beyond the sea that no one had seen or even heard of besides some old merchant nearly 2 decades ago. Not only that, but they'd done so with no real plan besides, let's have a gander. Understandably, many people assumed they'd be dead, so when they returned not only alive, but healthy and with a ship packed full of outlandish goodies, the worries of their loved ones did a full 180, bringing happiness and even inspiration to those they'd left behind, including good old Thorvald who, as you now know, didn't have the same luck they had. This voyage had elevated Leif to another level, so much so in fact that after his father's death not long after, he became chieftain himself, leading the Greenland settlement until his own passing a mere year or 5 later. We don't actually know how long he lived for. These guys really didn't like to write much down. And as you may have guessed, future expeditions to the American continent were scarce. Curiosity did drive a few later Norsemen to make their way across the sea in search of Vinland, but Curiosity was about all they had going for them. Between just how far it was, the isolation this created both culturally and economically would have been too much. They weren't much in the mood to establish an entirely independent settlement of its own, and maintaining a connection to Greenland just wouldn't have been feasible. Oh, and of course, we can't forget the very important factor of them being completely unwelcome by the natives, which proved to be the nail in the coffin, ensuring that every Viking settlement in the Americas remained seasonal at most. But like we said, if you want to hear that story, then you should stay tuned for the next video. This has been Jake from Flashback History, and see you next time.